So this movie was a little disappointing. Now before going into this movie, I was actually pretty interested in seeing it for two main reasons. One, because the trailer actually looked pretty promising, and two, mainly because this was an A24 film. Now for those of you who don't know what A24 is, they're a production company that's been producing a lot of movies for a good amount of time right now. You might recognize some of the movies such as Everything Everywhere All at Once, The Lighthouse, Civil War. They even produced one of my favorite movies of all time, Good Time, directed by the Safdie brothers. My impression of them is that they seem to be interested in the artists and would be giving them opportunities that a lot of artists wouldn't have gotten otherwise. So I'm always interested in what they're doing, but unfortunately this movie was not all that memorable to me. Now I'd say that the biggest issue with this movie for me personally would be the story and how it's presented and the fact that I didn't really find myself strongly connecting with it or its characters. There are also some personal conflicts presented throughout this movie that feel a little forced. Florence Pugh and Andrew Garfield felt like they fit their characters and were good in their roles, but I just wish I really cared about their relationship and the story they were telling. Another really weird thing that I found about this movie, and it kind of brought down the film to be honest, was the fact that the story was told in a non-chronological order, and it honestly didn't seem like there was much of a purpose to telling the story in this way, to be honest. It certainly didn't feel like it added anything to it thematically, and if anything it made it more difficult to get invested in the story and characters. The non-chronological order of the story also felt like it led to confusion and failure to deliver information in a concise way. There is one scene in particular that comes to mind, so it does involve some minor spoilers, so if you don't want to see spoilers for this, I guess skip ahead. So Florence Pugh's character is in a competition and also has cancer, and there's a scene near the end of the movie where Andrew Garfield's character confronts her character about her being in the competition, and in this particular scene she reveals that she's in the competition rather than wrestling from her cancer diagnosis. And it was at this moment that I realized that he didn't know that she was in the competition to begin with, which led to a lot of confusion on my part. Now to be fair, there was a scene earlier in this movie where she was asked to compete but said that she wasn't interested in it, but the way that this movie presents this entire story angle in this particular scene, it didn't feel like it was an actual personal conflict throughout the story. I wasn't even aware that Andrew Garfield's character didn't want her to compete to begin with. All this information just felt very poorly communicated, to be perfectly honest, and I think there were some other parts in the movie where it felt the information wasn't really clearly communicated. The cinematography in this movie was alright, I guess, nothing bad, but you can definitely tell they put some effort into it. It looks nice visually, but nothing really spectacular in that department. The music in this movie felt very cliched and forgettable. To be perfectly honest, it seems like this fits in every single other romance drama movie. Now this movie is not terrible overall, but for the most part I was just so uninvested by it, and I guess this does come down to sort of a personal preference type thing. So if you think you could get invested in this type of story and characters, then go for it obviously. But as for me, I'm gonna forget about this movie very soon, and this one gets a 5 out of 10. And I also got around to watching Robert Zemeckis' new movie Here, and I have to tell you, this movie was honestly pretty forgettable throughout. Now for those of you who are unfamiliar with this movie, which based off the box office scoring I wouldn't be surprised was a good number of you, this movie presents itself as a journey through time told from one single angle from a camera. So basically we're watching different time periods throughout this movie from one single angle. Now watching the trailer for this movie, I didn't really have any high expectations for it at all. Now going into the movie, I thought the gimmick would try to be a little too try hard with what it was trying to do, which I think is a good term to describe this movie. It's not overly pretentious or anything, it just feels like it's trying to do a little bit more with such a limited idea. Now the film's main idea and gimmick is not a terrible one, so to speak, but it just feels like it does such a poor job upon building on itself and exploring this idea. In all honesty, this entire gimmick probably would have been better suited for a short film or maybe even just an episode of a TV show, to be honest. Now the two main important issues that this movie has would be the story and editing. The story in and of itself is pretty uninspired, predictable, and basic throughout, not to mention the entire structure of the movie is very poorly thought out. Now the main storyline of this movie revolves around the Tom Hanks and Robin Wright characters throughout this movie, and basically these two just give the exact same performance as they did years ago in other Robert Zemeckis movies, and it's kind of forgettable and basically like we've seen it before. But Robin Wright's character throughout this entire movie is just so unlikable and annoying. Every time she complained about something in this movie, all I could think is just, wow, what a freaking jerk you are. Now the issues that this movie have go beyond just annoying, unlikable characters. The story, as I said, is very predictable and basic, but as the movie went on and it got near the end of the movie, I was just so bored and uninvested throughout all of it. The editing in this movie is also very poorly done. Sometimes there'll be a scene that's just going along normal, and then on the side of the screen it will focus on a certain object in the room, and then it will begin to play footage of a certain different time period from that movie. It will eventually then shift to that time period, and the way that it transitioned from time period to time period was just so inconsistent and poorly thought out. Now going into this movie, I thought it would originally start from the very beginning of the time periods and then slowly go on to other time periods, and that probably would have made more sense, but this movie was just very random with how it transitioned to different time periods. So in short, the directing and editing are not the strong points of this movie, and in all honesty, a week later watching this movie, I can't really remember anything substantial from it. I would call this movie just basically gimmick and no brain. So yeah, this one was very basic, uninspired, and poorly thought out at times, and I don't really recommend you see it. If you want to go see it and you're a huge fan of Robert Zemeckis', go ahead. And I have to be honest, if Tom Hanks, Robert Zemeckis, and Robin Wright were not involved in this movie, nobody would see it. So this one gets a 3 out of 10.